if we look at something like gender relations in early silent era films, first we sort of have to identify what gender relations are. Men versus women, men and women, and now that is made much more sort of complex or even complicated in the modern era because now gendered is much more fluid. It's not just so binary of men and women. In certain countries where gender is can be much more open and non-binary, non-traditional, whatever else. And so now those relationships in the media or movies would be much more complicated. If you think of gender relations, what do you think of?
If I gender relations.
I mean, you obviously notice the difference between men and women, right? Between boys and girls.
Mm, I'm a
Sure.
boy.
Well, I know. Well, that's good. You identify as a boy. That's that's probably okay. Um, do you know some boys that don't perhaps identify as a boy? Maybe they identify as a girl.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you feel about that?
Mm, I will far from that people.
Okay. So for you, it's
Maybe
something.
maybe they like boy.
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to like you, especially if you don't like them. And so I don't think you have to worry about them liking you too much because I think they usually kind of understand that aspect. I don't think there's any need to be afraid of that situation. I understand that coming from China, like these ideas would be sort of basically different than sort of your normal traditional thinking in some ways. I would say that my experience in China, obviously, there isn't a very large amount of transgendered people living openly. I know some that are sort of living secretly, and also the idea that I probably saw more girls that identified as boys in China than boys that would identify as girls in China. Now, mostly because in China, boys are the preferred child anyway. That's why the one child policy pushed it to 32 boys to one girl because of the fact that they were always wanting boys. And I think those daughters sometimes try to pass themselves as boys. And we see that actually throughout Chinese history. You see examples of that in different situations. So that's kind of interesting. When you went to Thailand, did you see any transgendered people like lady boys?
Yeah.
Okay. And so were you afraid of them?
Yeah.
Because you're so handsome, right? Well, to a certain extent, I'd have to say that if you go to some tourist place in Thailand, like Bangkok, Pattaya, Phuket, whatever else, and there are lady boys there, most of them are also sex workers for the most part. I shouldn't stereotype, but I would say that in those tourist areas where the concentration is, that's sort of what it is in certain neighborhoods, certain areas. Those transgendered individuals, which may be full op, pre op, half op, whatever it may be, um, they support themselves obviously through prostitution. And so I would say if you went to Thailand on a tour with a Chinese group, you probably went to a high traffic area like that. And if that's the case, the ones that you probably saw would be a bit more aggressive, trying to give you to get a massage or go out with them or whatever else it may be. So I don't think it's a really great example or experience the first time you meet somebody who's transgendered in that situation, but we have to put it within the frame to sort of understand why that's the case. Again, I don't think you have any need to be overly concerned, even as handsome as you are, William. I think it's understood that if you're not interested,
Huh.
you're not interested. Okay. All right. Let's go to before 1905 here with Kathy Peace. It's problematic for pronunciation and maybe some understanding. We talked a little bit in detail about gender relations and try to get a little bit of understanding from you. How you view gender relations from the traditional view to sort of what's happening now. Uh, Basically, what Kathy is suggesting here is that as far back as 1905, as soon as we started having movies, We had sort of these images, or I would say even now they're almost archetypes by the end of the paragraph, of sort of classic ideas of what men thought of women at that time. The funny thing about photography is it's my understanding that as soon as the French were able to get a camera, within the next week, there was nude postcards for sale everywhere, printed or whatever else. And so it's this idea of sexuality in our inspiration from art, where sometimes art imitates life and life imitates art. We're sometimes very connected, sort of really how we feel versus what we see or versus what we do. And different societies, different cultures have sort of different strata or different levels of that, that have different gaps sort of in between how they really feel inside about their sexuality, which is classically in my country, it's puritanical, it's repressed, it's suppressed. It's very sort of like we don't tell people what's going on with their sexuality and so forth. In your country, in China, I would say that sexuality is actually pretty open, as more of a function, like a bodily function, like taking a shit, or or getting sick. It's like, oh, okay, it's just part of your health. Like, you have sex, and if you have too much sex, it might prevent your longevity. So you shouldn't be overly sexual, right? On the other hand, kids are so busy anyway that they stifle so much of the pre puberty, I should say prepubescent, but puberty hormones that teenagers go through puberty. Um, Getting tongue tied is kind of awkward, in the sense that that in China it's you're so busy studying and so forth, you don't really have any opportunity to sort of express any sort of open sexuality or whatever else. Anyway, so 1905, which is 116 years ago, you know, we go through this period of about 20 years of cinema up to about post World War One, I would say. And we had sort of these different types of movies. We had movies that obviously were more reflective of what people really were interested in, really what they felt, which is this idea of salacious or salacious. Salacious in this case, like being salivating, like, ooh, you get to, ooh, what's really going on, And so salacious sexual imagery, which was, fairly racy, rated R, sort of so forth. And then the idea of risque humor. Risque humor, of course, would be sort of any kind of jokes that would be sort of sexual in that case, innuendo, that kind of thing. And basically, they said that this came out of the idea of burlesque and vaudeville, which was at that time before movies and TV. People would travel around in stages and so forth and entertain people, and a big part of that is going for the cheap laugh, and so it's really easy to get people excited if you use some sort of sexual imagery or a sexual joke or whatever else. And so even in Guangdong, I mean, I'd say the Cantonese definitely are more risque in their humor when they're teasing each other or joking with each other. They call each other, a stinking cunt, and your mom's pussy smells, and I mean just really bad things that they say in Cantonese, which because sometimes when I heard you get angry, you'll say some pretty nasty things. And so the idea here is that this is the glimpse of women disrobing, which is just a hint, just a peek of someone taking their clothes off, and then this idea of titillation and voyeurism as people like to watch and get excited by this. So this is very very male dominated sort of culture, because who's making the movies, right? Men, not women. Who's producing them, who's directing them, who's making them, distributed in theaters. It's all men essentially. So you don't really have any sort of female input here, aside from being uh, the muse or the object of desire or whatever else. And so we can see how movies begin to objectify women as a commodity or as a product, because at the end of the paragraph here, they sort of break down the different strata of what image that we could see of women. And so the only person that sort of is interested here is because we're talking more about D.W. Griffith, is this idea of this idealized, frail Victorian child woman. And so this is sort of dangerous territory, because this is where we get sort of into the suppression or the controlling aspect of this idealized sort of child woman that needs to have the man to take care of her and do all these things for her. And so it's an obsessive preoccupation with the woman being very honorable and her chastity. All women are virgins until they get married and so forth. And it's very sort of a strange sort of traditional view. I mean, from 116 years later, we think, wow, this is kind of really like, oh no, wait, that sounds like Texas. Sorry. Um, so the images of femininity is how we see women, right? And so even for yourself, if you watch different movies now and you see some girl that you think is good looking or is a good actress, you think, wow, that's interesting. Or you might see a girl that's playing some sort of other role. And so that's what they're talking about here is someone who is either sexually aggressive, and so that would be the woman that, wants to have sex with everybody, or to sort of the girl next door who maybe, is, athletic and energetic and wholesome, and she's a hardworking urban gal, and so when people try to hit on her, or try to give her drugs or alcohol so they can have sex with her, she's like, no, you can't do that. She's very sort of protective of herself. And this idea of lasciviousness of a boss, so it was a given, as if you were a woman, you worked for your boss, and your boss might try to hook up with you and so forth. On the
Mm,
other end of this, of course, you have the girls, the party girls, the chorus girls, or the burlesque queens who make their money by entertaining men and so forth. The one that we missed in here is this idea of sophisticated manner. And so I think even for you, you can understand sort of the difference between someone who is sophisticated and not sophisticated. Even in Chinese culture, we think that there's certain aspects of style or education or status that has some sort of sophistication, meaning that it is very refined, in the sense that it has a lot of different angles and complexities to it, through experience, through status, and so forth. And so it's very sort of rare in some cases, depending on what the setting is, as opposed to unsophisticated. And so for me, a lot of entertainment is unsophisticated. If you're just going to show naked women and show blood and show killing, it's not very sophisticated for a movie. It's, just visual, garbage. On the other hand, if you have some sort of story or some sort of interest or some sort of exposition that brings you into the movie, then we consider that much more sophisticated. And we can see the difference in that in film, definitely. Okay, so then we dive into more specifically D.W. Griffith, in this case, who set up sort of the studio model for Hollywood as far back as in 1910. Essentially, when they had an acting troupe, and so that's a word in French, but basically a group of actors that they used on a regular basis. And so basically, they list some of the actors there whose descendants are still working in Hollywood, like Lionel Barrymore. His great great granddaughter is Drew Barrymore, who has a popular TV show, but was a popular actress in Charlie's Angels and so forth. Um, and the other little girls that here that they're talking about as well. So when they said they wanted to explore new territories, what they're talking about is, basically a new area, a new place. We talk about territories sometimes for China. It gets people very nervous because they think there might be some sort of expansion, into those ideas. And again, it's nothing to be concerned about. And so they basically sort of discovered the idea of Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood is not just an idea; it's an actual place on the map. You can go to Hollywood. I mean, I don't know why you would, but um, at one time it was where all the movies were made and all the entertainment and so forth. And so it attracted people to come in there. But they were sort of the first ones that started that idea. And so basically, by sort of changing what they did with film, he sort of inadvertently, it means that he didn't mean to sort of encourage the development of the star system, which means that they had a series of movies that had sort of the same person that became sort of very attractive to the public. And so they call them a star, right? A rising star. In China, we have movie stars, we have TV stars, we have music stars, we have even political or athletic stars in some cases, maybe even educational stars. Uh, However you want to say it's fine. And they said the newspapers were deluged. And so, again, another French word coming into English, dealing with the word flood, meaning that too many people were contacting them for the actors' names. They want to know who are these people, right? And so the studios oftentimes would not divulge their identity. They would not reveal. They wouldn't show really any too much about the person aside what was on the screen. And so now we get into sort of the crafty part or the creative part or the business part here of D.W. Griffith, not only as a filmmaker, but as a promoter. As the producer here, basically it's his job to sort of assemble the actors and the cameramen and the editors and the movie theaters and the distributors, and he puts them sort of all together to make this movie, this thing happen, which is a product. And that's why I highlighted the word here, movie industry. It is an industry, even though we consider it to be part of our culture. You know, we're talking about movies as a cultural artifact. Anytime we talk about entertainment, we will have to realize it is an industry. That's why I said it takes millions of dollars to make movies now. And so when they make a movie, they want to make sure to get their investment back. In this case, because he had a small group of actors, basically had a small sort of talent pool related into actually producing the film and distributing the film, so that this way he can sort of guarantee the production value, like his investment. How much money did he put in to produce this, and how much does it cost? And then the trademark value, which is something that's very important in business even now. I mean, it's one of the things that during the idea of the WTO and China and other countries in the world is like, how do we make sure our trademark for our product, in this case, the movie is the actual product, how can we protect that? The insurance value, believe it or not. You know, insurance is something that's a big part of movies to guarantee production, to make sure actors are safe, all these things, because essentially you're sort of setting up a small work site for a period of weeks or months, depending on the production. So it's like setting up a new factory, but the factory is going to only operate for a short period of time, and so you have to have insurance because things do happen. And so it says that all of these are very potent and very strong in guaranteeing the sale of the product. So we put all these resources in here and we treat it like a product. It's entertainment, it is cultural in its value, but it's also a product. And so one of the things they sort of cite here is the difference in the pay from $400 a week to $10,000 a week in 1960. And I would say that's a lot of money in equivalent to our salaries now. We could go and take a look at that later. Again, I always want to consider this as the movie industry and thinking about the idea of profits. And so a lot of times when we see things that are really important in movies and TV and music or whatever else, we always have to understand that if it's very popular, it's because someone is making money. And why are they making money? Is because they understand the audience. And so all of this led to people studying his theory and methods, his ideas, and the way that he puts his ideas in place to make his business successful. In this case, he's in the movie business. All right, good job. This particular section is a little bit confusing, even to me as a native speaker. It seems to be maybe an excerpt from a longer article, and sort of they sort of cut it down. And so there's sort of no real transition from this idea about D.W. Griffith sort of founding Hollywood. And then we go jump into this idea that when America entered the war, the only problem I have with this is the framing of, again, I think this is probably cut from a longer article. So the transition here to come from 1905 to enter the war would make me think it would be World War One, but it's not. It says Hollywood feared that the industry would be subject to heavy-handed government censorship, blah blah blah. But the government itself wanted no repeat of World War One, and so what they're saying here is no repeat means that they're actually referring to World War Two. Now, to me, that would be sort of confusing. I mean, I'd have to go back and read this again. And so, if this came out of the exam, I'd be really sort of cautious about this because there isn't any transition here about which war we're talking about. Is it World War One or World War Two? Until we get to this line here, no repeat of World War One. So this means that they're talking about the Second World War. Okay, great. But in academic writing or even thesis writing, I would suggest that we would introduce that. So I'm guessing that probably between paragraph B and C, there's actually a lot more stuff, and they cut it down for the length of the article here, and so the transition's not very good. What is interesting here is that Hollywood feared that the industry would be subject to heavy-handed government censorship. This is essentially when the government says what you can say, what you cannot say, what you can do, what you can't do on film, and so forth. And so it exhibits a lot of control based on some sort of policy or morality. It depends on the government, it depends on the situation, depends on the time in this case. And so censorship was a big thing. So we go from the beginning of film in the article where anything goes. Let's, show naked women and tell dirty jokes and, be really sort of far out there. And then someone like D.W. Griffith comes along and says, no, 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 I want to sort of promote this other idea. And so again, this is art imitating life, and I mean the art of movies. Is it following sort of the lifestyle that's happening here between 1905 and World War One, World War Two, or is it the other way around, where art is imitating life, or is life following it? And sometimes we can't tell the difference because something becomes so popular in the public mind through movies or through TV or music or radio or sports that basically it sort of changes the way the public sort of feels about things or does things, and then it sort of turns around. And so as it's turning around, and it's feeling or changing its idea, the entertainment that also changed it is also changing to sort of follow it. So it's sort of like a strange kind of circle. I think perhaps in dialectic logic, maybe in Asia, we probably could make those separations. We probably could have simultaneous uh, systems like that as well. We do worry about government censorship, and I think the recent cartoon, which I thought was pretty funny, which is, my country is like, we're mad at 10 cent, and so the next thing, of course, is your president says, yeah, I'm mad at 10 cent too. Wait a second, how can we both agree, right? And so that's really hard sometimes for American foreign policy to sort of understand the idea of government control over these things, because I do think that in China we have a better understanding of what those relationships are and what they actually can mean, and because they have a longer sort of span of idea, having a very long culture, even though China's from 1949, the modern China, but we still have the benefit of the long sort of idea of culture and its effect on society, and sort of what information that we use and so forth. So I think it's very well sort of orchestrated in some cases. The concern here is that it said it whipped up. Whipped up means to sort of get people excited about, like whipping, and the idea of hysteria is kind of like crazy. We know that we've had incidences in China where there things did get whipped up and did have hysteria, such as in I think it was in Guangdong, yeah, as a matter of fact, where they had some people had gotten fired from the factory, and they went online and they said some terrible things about people from Xinjiang. And so the next day, when the Xinjiang workers came, everybody attacked them in Guangdong, which got everybody upset in Xinjiang. And so it led to a lot of other sort of ramifications. After that event happened, that's when sort of the crackdown on social media happened. That's when they sort of begin to cut Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff like that. It all sort of came hand in hand. I think the Chinese realized that because of mass population, and a lot of that population is not very sophisticated, that with the sort of the wrong information, it can be problematic because they'll get upset very quickly. But we also see that in my country. We see also a population that maybe is not also very sophisticated, in the sense that what they know, but they don't go out of their way to sort of understand more. And so we consider them to be hung hao lo, or Shang Mui. You know what I mean? I don't want to say countryside people because that's a bad stereotype. What I'm saying is people that are maybe somewhat unsophisticated, in the sense that when they see information, they don't question it. And so if majority of people in my country get most of their information from social media like Facebook, which recent survey indicates like 65% of people get their news from Facebook, which is very scary, because there's no sort of vetting or any sort of oversight in that case, aside from corporate oversight or for what Facebook is doing itself and its own policy. Yes, it's been pressured by government and from the populace to say, hey, you need to get better control of content or the material that you're displaying on Facebook, because it is causing people that maybe are willing to sort of take that at face value and say that's the truth, which is probably the biggest reason why we're still having difficulty with the pandemic now, is because of so much disinformation or misinformation through things like Facebook and other social media. But I would also say that a lot of foreign entities are also playing within that. We have a lot of Russian trolls and Russian bots that have a pretty good understanding of how social media works in my country, and how they could sort of, again, make that manipulation of showing some sort of entertainment and people sort of changing their ideas, and so that it always kind of revolves around these aspects. And so if that's the case, then we have to sort of either provide people the tools to be a bit more sophisticated. And so that also sort of runs into a problem, because then their idea of sophistication is like doing more research, which is watching YouTube videos or Facebook videos, not understanding that the algorithm, the AI, or the very complex mathematical equation that controls what we see and do on the internet, is sort of reflecting those things to them. The same way that audiences that watch the original movies that we're talking about here, were interested in seeing those things, and so it reflected it back to them because that's what they wanted. That's why it becomes popular. And so the problem is, again, art imitating life, and then life imitating art, and it gets very confusing in that case. All right, so the gist of it is this paragraph for me is sort of out of sync without the other pieces in it. Okay, in D, what we're looking at here is this sort of brings it back into play. The idea that the formation of the movie trust ushered, means it brought forth, it brings in this period of a rationalization within the film industry. And so again, we talked about the movie industry earlier, and thinking about this as a movie business, but a business among many different players, to the point where it becomes an industry, it becomes industrialized, this process. Whereas in the past, somebody could make a movie sort of as an individual with their friends or whatever else, but who could see it? There's no distribution, or there's no sort of standardization in this case. And so to say that it becomes rationalized means that it becomes sort of sane. Whereas in the beginning, it was probably was a free for all. People were just making movies anywhere and whatever would go, because the demand was so high anyway. And so we do have some examples of these cultural artifacts of some of these little sort of strange little movies that people had made, that actually were popular at that time. I mean, there's always room for independent cinema and independent films, even now. But again, it's the expense that seems to bar a lot of that. And I would suggest that most of the independent sort of filmmaking, or free or gonzo filmmaking that's done, ends up on the internet now anyway. So it doesn't have sort of the same punch or impact that it did back then, because of distribution. I mean, you had to go to a certain distribution point, a theater, to see this product or to enjoy this product, until finally television came along, and then television could bring the product into your home. And so we see a progression of entertainment through film or through television into the internet and so forth. I would suggest this is somewhat parallel to what happened in China when the internet did open. When I got to China in 2007, you still could see a lot of internet cafes, bawanga. And so, I ventured into an internet cafe a few times because I needed to send some email or something. And it was, it was like the worst thing I ever saw. People sleeping high on ketamine, cigarettes everywhere, beer bottles. I mean, it was just a really gross place of sort of grungy guys, just playing World of Warcraft, for days at a time, eating noodles and so forth. I mean, they were all kind of the same, but also very different, in the aspect that, what they did in there was the same, but sometimes they'd have a really nice looking place and it would be absolutely trashed on the inside, or it would look very trashy on the outside, and you go in and it would be a palace. So I don't know if you've ever been to an internet cafe. I mean, you probably didn't have to, because once you were old enough to use the internet, it was on your phone anyhow. So the rationalization of the film industry, the parallel for me is that when the internet first sort of opened up in China, and then we had all this access to gaming and gambling and porn and all this other stuff, That's the same thing. It was just like film when it first came out. Anything goes. But then what happens is, as it becomes an industry where people make money and they want to guarantee profits or guarantee a flow of resource and so forth, then it has to be standardized. Things have to sort of follow into place to become a commodity or commodified product. And so in the process of what these guys did is the first thing they did was they sort of upgraded the theaters. So people were encouraged to go out to the movie theater. And if you've seen some of the classic movie theaters that we have in America, they are like palaces. I mean, they're just beautiful. I mean, they're just done very exorbitantly. It's sort of the same thing sometimes when we go into a How Chinese person's house, and it looks, very like something out of Marie Antoinette or whatever else. But it reminds me of that opulence, that sort of excessive style of grandeur and so forth. Um, they guaranteed the product by taking out the faulty product, anything that was damaged in circulation. So obviously, films are very sort of sensitive at that time, especially nitrate films are very susceptible or easy to damage. And so, it's big canisters that they have to distribute over long periods of places. It's not like they had FedEx or, what is the Chinese Post delivery. They didn't have the logistics back then, and so things got damaged. And of course, people would try to show them anyway because they have an audience, so they want to show them something. But basically, they would take the damaged prints out, so to make sure that there was quality in their product. And so the big part of this is they say this is a period of intense artistic and technical innovation. And so a period can be defined by, several years or an era, whatever it may be. And so as we have the standardization and the rationalization come in for the industry, it does sort of force people to sort of really become much more artistic but technical in what they're doing. Different sort of shots, different sort of lighting, different sort of special effects. It allows them to sort of encourage to have some sort of innovation in their industry when things are sort of stable in this case. And so pioneering directors like David Ward Griffith, that's D.W. Griffith. Okay, you don't have to say D period W period, just say D.W. Griffith. And because he's a pioneer means he's like the first one out, like the same thing when we say pioneers go out to a new country or new settlers, whatever else. And so through his process of doing all these things, he revolutionized. It means that he changed the film industry dramatically. In this case, the screen narrative. The same way that we tell a story, we have a narrative, we have a narration, we have a hero, problem, a solution, all these things that go on. And so once we have a narrative that we can follow on the screen, it makes it a lot easier for people to understand what they're seeing. If you have no exposition or sort of no background for context or whatever else, sometimes people have difficulty connecting or relating to your story. It's the same thing in language. Sometimes when you do writing or you're talking to me, and if you don't put in sort of the subtext or the lead up or the transition, it's hard for us to follow. And so people have that natural feeling when they see a story that they also cannot sort of understand sort of how it's unfolding or why it's happening. Yes, some movies do that on purpose to have that effect, but usually they give you some sort of indication that that's going to be the case. And so then you, as the audience, have to be a bit more active in your participation for that. All right, so let's get into a little bit more here about D.W. Griffith specifically and Hollywood. All right, Hollywood. As I can tell, you're not feeling good, so we won't go through the rest of this. Just work on the listening. Um, you know, with only 6 months of film experience, this guy basically sort of made a big dent in the industry early on through the Biograph Company. And so the Biograph Company was a film company that had probably several different people that they were using to direct movies and make movies and so forth. But to think that this guy was making $50 a week, okay, doesn't sound like a lot compared to his actress who's making $400 a week. But for him, it's 1/20th of a cent. So this would be like fawn in Chinese, right? Fawn, I think, is 1/10 of a cent. So it'd be like two fawn. And so that means that basically for every foot, so basically every 5 feet of film, he would get a penny. It doesn't sound like a lot of the time, but if you think about how many feet are in a reel of film, we could look that up and say, all right, we'd sort of estimate, what is a one reeler? One reeler, I think, used to be about 15 to 20 minutes. So basically, it's just one reel of film, which has a certain amount of percentage. So basically, he had a low sort of weekly salary, probably just to live on. But the real money is how many of these films could he rent to theaters or rental exchange that would distribute into theaters. And so, if he could do 30, 40, 50 of them, obviously he would be making a lot more money than anybody else in this case. And so it was really sort of probably the reason why he tried to standardize the practice in many places and perfect the techniques, because he wanted people to see his movies because he makes more money every time that happens. And so that's always an inspiration, right? Is if you do it a certain way, you can make more with your product. And so we had things like writers and cinematographers and different sort of effects and devices for close up and slow motion and fade in, fade outs. These are all film techniques. And basically, he did it differently. He didn't treat it like the stage anymore. He decided to use that as part of the storytelling. And so by coming into a close up on someone to help convey the feeling of what was going on, maybe with the music that was accompanying it or something like that. And so basically, it changes storytelling. Remember, I mean, film, as it's been so astutely uh, paraphrased as white man's magic, and in the sense that Native Americans, their magic is through storytelling, which is usually done, through song and drum and dance and so forth in some art. But for us, we always take it to a different level. Our storytelling is in our movies. And so by having all these sort of effects in the movies and so forth, we can really get people to sort of come into the story. And again, it's that art imitating life, life imitating art. People used to watch these, series and really believe these people were an extension of not only who they are, but their family and so forth. Even Marshall McLuhan had said that about television in the late 60s, and the things of like a sitcom or soap operas and whatever else, situation comedies, where the family on TV literally becomes the real family for some people. They become so invested in the characters and so forth. And a lot of that has to do with the techniques that this guy sort of, brought into the industry as a standardization to capture people's imagination and feeling and basically part of their ego in some ways. Um, and big part of that is the quality of the acting. And so if you have a lot of people that are sort of overacting like they used to on stage, because they'd have to, because people would be sitting far away in the background in order to see you, they'd have to see the motion and all that other stuff like that. It's not needed in film. In film, it can be a very sort of personal experience between you and the screen. And so keeping that in mind is having the director's eye of showing that and so forth. And so this helps to capture the audience attention. And for him, capturing the audience attention is great because he makes more money. So fast forward to the 20s and the 30s here. You've got a small group of film companies that are consolidated. Then they control most of the film industry. They're known as the Big Five. And even to this day, these are still pretty large companies. They're bought by other transnational or trans conglomerates. And so you had Paramount, Warner Brothers, RKO, 20th Century, and Lowell's slash MGM. And then the little three, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. And so basically, these are fully formed integrated companies. And the old full film companies' opposition was sort of, shocked by the up and coming people, the new tycoons. And so the confusion of the tongues in foreign versions of American films deepened when American directors themselves embarked on shooting of the new version. And so again, we have something here in the article where there's no sort of transition of this idea of confusion of tongues, which is sort of a strange idea, but basically what they're talking about is getting the film distributed internationally, in other languages and so forth. And so sometimes, we can see examples of movies that were done in America and then see sort of the Jada or the Chabadoa knockoff version in another country. There's a lot of good ones, I think, like the Turkish Spider-Man movies is a version of the Spider-Man movies that were popular previously. And so it's very sort of interesting because it's all done in their language, done with their special effects and so forth. And of course, it looks kind of, silly or strange to people that know the original one. But if you didn't know the difference, hey, Turkish Spider-Man, that's the way it goes. And so basically we went to the first market we went to here is they didn't usually speak Spanish or given the target language, and so there was only a few translators that were there from the studio, and so it was more general to contract Spanish directors, actors, and screenwriters to produce American films in Spanish for Latin American audiences. And so the one of the best examples I can think of is 1933 is Bela Lugosi's Dracula, which during the day was filmed with Bela Lugosi and so forth, and they did the movie. And when they stopped filming at the end of the day, the the Spanish or Mexican crew would come in and they would make the Spanish version with all Mexican directors, Mexican actors, and so forth. Probably some of the crew was the same. It's very interesting to see those two movies that how they're done sort of in parallel. If you ever watch the original sort of Bela Lugosi Dracula and the Spanish version, it's scene for scene, it's exactly the same, except it's different actors in Spanish. And so it's very sort of surreal, especially if you posit them together sometimes. And some people say that the Spanish version is actually somewhat superior for its effect and so forth. And I would say that probably because people were trying harder, maybe to make a difference in that case. So it says here public and the Iberian Peninsula. And so Iberian Peninsula, I'm assuming, is probably South Africa. I don't have to take a look at here where Iberia is in this case. Hollywood had depended on overseas markets for as much as 40% of its revenue. That's pretty huge. 40% of your total revenue for your industry or company overseas. Yeah, definitely. You need to cater to that market. And so, an effort to nurture their own film industries and prevent an excessive outflow of dollars. So other countries recognize that, yeah, we're bringing in a lot of Hollywood movies because they're done really well and so forth. And even though they've been dubbed or translated or whatever the case may be, specialized for our audience, we're losing our own money. And so countries like Britain, France, and Italy basically put a lot of stiff import tariffs, restrictive quotas on the amount of American movies. It's the same thing in your country. There's only so many American movies that can be shown in China, and they have to go through a rigorous process of being, vetted and whatever else, make sure the content is safe and so on. And so one of the ways that we've gotten around that is we've involved Chinese investment, like Tencent. Tencent, even though it's having some difficulty right now with the mainland government, in the sense that there's been some restrictions put on, for the gaming content. All the gaming rules have changed, and then some of the content has changed as well. But in movie production, it's still a great source of revenue or financing. And so now we see a lot more American movies that are financed by Tencent, a Chinese company, but also include Chinese content as far as maybe a Chinese actor or a Chinese subplot or something like that, or a Chinese location. Simultaneously, the version in China will be much more Chinese with that character in their language and so forth than it would be in American for an American audience. And so I noticed that very different, the difference between uh, watching a movie, Hollywood movie in China, and then coming to America and seeing it, or on the airplane and seeing sort of two different versions of the movie, because it had more content for China or more content for America. So that they do that because again, it's a product, it's a commodity, so they'll make those changes when it is necessary. All right. Basic problem facing today's Hollywood is the rapidly rising cost of making and marketing a movie. As I said that all along, it's super expensive. The average is 40 million today. I'd say that this is an old article because this is a very conservative number estimation for a large Hollywood movie. The 40 million for a budget, it's much more than that in some cases. Sometimes 10 times that, depending on who's doing it. So the immense cost of producing movies has led the studios to seek a guaranteed hit. So imagine being an industry that is producing an item, and they have to make sure that that item is going to turn a profit. And so, that's not always the case. It can't always happen that way. And so sometimes movies cost a lot of money and sort of fail in the box office or fail internationally or fail for whatever reason, the story, the plot, or sometimes again the art imitating life and life imitating art. In that circle, it's sort of out of sync. It's either ahead of the curve, and so people don't understand it, don't like it, and ignore it, or it's behind that sort of curve where those things that people have already sort of gotten over or not interested anymore, don't care and don't want to revisit, and so it's sort of in a holding pattern until it turns all the way around again. And it does happen. Sometimes some movies become a cult classic over a long period of time where they still had some sort of value for an audience, or it finally finds an audience when it goes to television, or in the old days when it used to go to VCR or DVD, and to develop an audience because people felt comfortable with it in their home, but not so much going out to theater to see. But now with streaming and all the sort of social media ways that we can distribute entertainment or film, it's also sort of coming down to a lot of niche and tribalism and little what's the word, nodes and subcultures of people that are following movies now that could be produced for this. So they want to guarantee that they get a return on their investment. And so there's going to be lots of special effects. They want to make sure that the story can sustain a sequel. That's why the superhero films are fantastic, because you've got comic books, so you already have the stories established, you already have nostalgia established, you have sort of the paneling is already done, the exposition is already done, and so the sequels can be added. So like the MCU, the Marvel Universe, even though after the Infinity War is over, we're going to go into the next generation or next level of MCU movies, and so we'll see how long that plays out. I think that the whole superhero thing is getting to the point where people are starting to, okay, we want something else or something different, more viable than what it is, because the audience is changing. The latest release of Shang-Chi from Marvel, of course, is being stifled in your country because of the comments that he made about Taiwan. And so that's kind of sad because, it's sort of the Marvel Chinese superhero debut. And so even in his own sort of country of heritage where his skills and stuff come from, he's sitting on the sidelines because some actor, put his foot in his mouth. So again, it's all about profit and control. All right. Remakes, earlier movies, in this case, foreign films, even old TV shows. So Hollywood has always sought to sort of cope with the rising costs by focusing more intently on the core audiences. And so since the mid 80s, before you were born, but when I was your age, the movie going audience has continued to decrease in size. And so ticket sales have fallen from 1.2 billion in 1983 to 950 million in 1992, with the biggest drop occurring among adults. And since over half of Hollywood's profits are overseas, the target market has to be changed due to the increasing cost of salary of making a film. And so the industry, now it's funny that they put this on the actors demanding a high salary. Well, of course, now that's all changed, definitely, since this article appeared. The industry has concentrated much of its energy on crude action films, easily understood by an international audience, featuring stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, which was the big part of the 80s and the 90s, because it was really easy to see these kind of movies without worrying about the dialogue or the exposition or the subtext or the plot. Basically, might makes right. Uh, Big man, big gun, he wins, good. Everybody goes home, they're happy. The special effects all around. Again, not very sophisticated, but of course it has grown in sophistication, especially with special effects and CGI and so forth. So film as, again, a cultural artifact, I think is extremely interesting. One, because obviously I love film. I love living in China because I can watch a lot of movies often within a schedule, or series, or whatever it may be. I had lots of time for that sort of onboarding entertainment. Going to film school, studying film, and then having a chance to talk to students about film is always amazing, because again, if it is white man's magic about storytelling, and it's a great way to find out about white men, quote unquote. I'm talking about Western society for the most part, as compared to indigenous society or things like that. So don't get too bent out of shape if you don't get the context or the subtext. All right. Okay. If you're still alive, then we'll go through the questions here themselves. All right. So give me just a moment.